Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. New alternate history hub video. Hey guys. Original link to the video from alternate history hub, top of the description. Preemptive like, my name's Connor. If you're new, I like to learn things on YouTube, usually. With you, or the help of you. Let's go. What if England never became French? Talking about the Normans. Title kind of messed with my head for a second. Okay, let's go.
William the Conqueror, the lord across the Channel who invaded and united. William the Conqueror, the lord across the Channel who invaded and united the Seven Kingdoms. Sound familiar? It should. George R. R. Martin drew a lot of inspiration from a multitude of historical events for his series, especially British history. Yet, sadly, in our real history, William's conquest didn't feature any dragons. He was still pretty effective, though. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 is one of the most defining engagements in world history, and it almost went the other way. William's horse was shot down in the middle of conflict. Instead of retreating, he mounted a new horse, rallied his troops to fight on, and that horse was shot down as well. Ouch. Usually this would cause the leader to be injured or flee in panic, but like Jon Snow, William had plot armor. He won the day.
Plot armor. I know it's a joke, but for some reason that's like... It's a, obviously, or else someone else would have. Never mind, not important. It just made me think about horses and how they've sort of been with us over time and fought in so many battles with us. Like we usually think of, I mean, not of their own choice, which is, you know, but we usually think of dog as man's best friend, right? Which there's a case, but horses might even be a better friend. Again, not really of their own choice, but let's go.
Took the throne, accidentally burned down half of London during his coronation, and went back home to Normandy, not realizing that he had just changed our history forever. England, after all, was a relatively new kingdom, one on the edge of Europe, ruled by Anglo-Saxons, raided by Vikings. How influential could one battle truly be? Very influential, it turns out.
Tapestry.
So, what if in an alternate timeline, William lost that influential battle? What if William the Conqueror never conquered England? Today we perceive Britain as this impenetrable island that many wished to conquer, but never could. It's a well-earned reputation after what happened to the Spanish fleet, and Napoleonic fleet, and aborted Operation Sea Lion, and those aliens. Here's the thing though, there was a time this wasn't the case. Prior to Britannia ruling the seas, anyone with a fleet could theoretically sail to England and claim it for themselves. The original Celts were conquered by the Romans were squashed by the Anglo-Saxons, from which we get the name England, and the Anglo-Saxons were pillaged and ransomed by the Norsemen, and some of those Norsemen decided to stay. Speaking of ancestry, this video is sponsored by MyHeritage.
Guys, especially when I'm watching a really new video, obviously I'm going to watch through the ad if you want to watch with me. That's great, and I'd appreciate if you use all the links and promo codes they have. It's only fair. The original link to the video, top of the description. Please use the promo codes there if you're interested and you saw it here. If you want to fast forward, that's up to you.
What a segue. MyHeritage is the #1 family history service, which is why this is my third time collaborating with them. No better service helps you uncover your...
Guys, I got Ancestry DNA tested, and I am 99.6% European, and I'm 97.9% British, just the British Isles, like England and or Ireland and the UK. Does that mean I'm like inbred or something like that? I don't know. Hopefully not.
Very own past and rediscover connections lost to time. You know, like the Norman war crime one. It's not a one-time thing. It's something that keeps growing as more information is uncovered. You know, like a tree. All it takes is just building a tree. Start with yourself, your relatives, and then watch as it begins to grow. With instant discoveries, MyHeritage can add entire lines that you didn't even know existed. Whole new paths to uncover. Like how my family has just been in Ohio for like 2 centuries. like that specific part of Ohio, really since Americans first got there, which is actually very funny because they never really left. Go Buckeyes. Pretty sure another section of my family is from Canada, like a small section, a great aunt. Most, however, just remained in upper New York since colonization. Really, in the grand scheme of it all, for the last few centuries, my family moved a lake. There are
33 billion plus
historical documents on MyHeritage to find records of your members. Use their top-notch photo-enhancing software to enhance old pictures, or even animate them to bring old memories to life.
No, that's weird. Okay, I'm sorry. This is the one thing that, like, I don't want this. I don't want to see my old deceased relatives animated in facial expressions that they didn't make themselves. Something a little strange about that to me. Maybe that's just me.
A 14-day free trial by clicking the link in the description to enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer. So once again, special thanks to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Sign up using the link below and begin your family discovery today. Each one of these groups was like a patch update to this land, fundamentally altering the demographic and cultural composition of southern Britain, which for millennia had been seen as kind of a backwater region on a backwater island. Not for the Anglo-Saxons though, who made this island their home, and that home was under attack. The period of intense Viking raids had hardened the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, forcing them to adopt heavy measures.
Part of me, before I started learning more about history and movement of people, thought like, well, so the English were conquered by non-English people to become England, right? And I'm like, but that's literally everywhere. Is no single place on this planet is inhabited by the people that have been there forever. And that's just part of, you know, the human story.
To fight off such an existential threat.
Sorry. Battle of
Forcing
Eddington.
them to adopt heavy measures. To fight off such an existential threat, the Anglo kings concentrated their power, levied taxes, built ships, and raised mighty hosts to fend off a great heathen army. While most of Europe was incredibly decentralized, this dire situation forced England to fortify, and fast. In 924, the Seven Kingdoms were finally forged into one. Although, even still, the powerful earldoms made up of shires each had their own regional customs and culture. Many had Christian traditions that were still intertwined with pagan practices. Despite swearing fealty to the new Rex Anglorum, or King of the English in Latin, there was still a power struggle between the earls. The idea of a single unified realm was a fairly new concept to England. They were gonna have to get used to it. Despite that little hiccup though, things remained relatively stable for a while. About a century or so. A few generations later, there was Edward the Confessor, who reigned for 24 years. He was a saintly king. His era was marked by peace. But you know what they say, it's all fun and games until the king dies. With no great desire to expand his kingdom, or produce royal heirs, or put down the numerous schemes his nobles were hatching, Edward's death in 1066 led to a little bit of a family
Where's Harold Godwinson?
squabble. A medieval succession war. Normally, succession wars are very bloody family affairs, but unlike other European kingdoms, England had something different. England had the Witan. What's a Witan, you wonder? Well, it was a primitive form of election, where a council of wise men elected their next ruler. Kings and archbishops could only nominate contenders. It was this election, and this election alone, that was the deciding factor. The Witan was what elected the very first king of England, the Rex Anglorum, and
Can we bring back this letter, please?
was what elected the
combined A and E. I'm not suggesting we bring it back because I know some purpose it'll have in language. It just looks cool, you know? That's the only reason I have.
First king of England, the Rex Anglorum, and 100 years later in 1066, the Witan once again voted for a new king, unanimously selecting Harold Godwinson. Thing is though, the throne was claimed by someone else, Harold Hardrada. Yes, there was a Harold and a Harold. I'll try to make this as least confusing as possible.
Oh my god, English history is so bad with this. It's, oh god. Anne, John, Henry, Harold. Kill me. Don't, but it can be confusing. And Anne, the other Anne, Mary this, Mary Tudor, Mary Queen of Scots, this Mary, that Mary. God damn it.
Just remember that Harold with an A was a Viking legend. If you've never heard of Harold Hardrada before,
sounds
he was
familiar.
The guy, an adventurer who
Badass
fought
name.
Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and Norse, became king of Norway, and now wanted to add the English throne to his list of titles. He was so great that after his death, the Vikings just decided to give up on the whole pillaging thing. Yeah, but wait a second.
So, fighting Muslims, Rus, did you say Bulgars? So is that by going down the Danube or the Dnieper River? Maybe Volga? Dnieper?
Is that another fighter entering the ring? Oh my god, it's William of Normandy. William had spent the last 2 decades putting down rebellions and fighting against Brittany and the French crown itself. Now he was ready for the ultimate challenge, for which he gathered an army of 7,000 men, including 2,000 elite heavy cavalry. All across the coast of his duchy, shipwrights got busy constructing his new armada. On the opposite
Jersey
shore,
and Guernsey?
Godwinson was ready to defend his crown and spent day and night on the defenses in southern England.
But he's going to have this... Is this going to be... I've mentioned this alternate history scenario. Did they get this idea from me to do the video? No, they didn't, but I mentioned this. Is his alternate history scenario going to say that Godwinson never had to go up north to fight a Viking army and then having to go down south? And he's going to say, let's say he never had to go north, and so he defeated him here. I'm calling it. I said this months ago.
But that's when one of the most random events in history unfolded. You see, despite its short length, the English Channel is notoriously dangerous to cross. When we're talking about transporting 7,000 troops in one go, that is only possible between May and September. Everything outside of that would be like trying to cross over lava, and everyone knew it. Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, after which William instantly began working on his new fleet, a fleet which would be ready at the start of September. Problem is, strong winds prevented him from departing, so for weeks, the armies of both Godwinson and the Bastard waited for the weather to clear. In the meantime, Hardrada decided to spice things up, sailing across the North Sea and landing in Yorkshire on September 8th, accompanied by the former Earl of Northumbria, Tostig. Their combined force was enormous, and threatened Northumbria, Tostig.
Really, bro?
Their combined force was enormous and threatened to restore the Danelaw to England. Godwinson took a risk, force marching his men 185 miles in 4 days in order to confront Hardrada, exhausting the Anglo-Saxon army. In his mind, the window of opportunity for William had closed. The next time William could even challenge his rule was next year, in May 1067. By the time he arrived, York had already fallen, and 2 of his earls were defeated. The situation was bleak. Hardrada was a living legend, and yet, despite all the odds, the Anglo-Saxons succeeded, vanquishing the Northmen at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Hardrada and Tostig lay dead on the battlefield, and out of 300 ships used to transport his army, the remnants only managed to fill 24 of them. So imagine you're Godwinson. You secured the throne, you rushed to the north and defeated the most legendary warrior of the day,
and then
only to then be delivered the news that the Bastard landed on your shores 3 days after your triumph, alongside 2,000 battle-hardened knights, who will define the military meta until the arrival of gunpowder. The Normans secured the beachhead and began raiding the countryside, hoping to lure the Anglo-Saxons, who are now marathoning back south.
So is William very thankful for Hardrada? I'm
On
assuming.
April 14th, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, the Viking shield wall met the Norman heavy cavalry charge, and it lasted the entire day. The Anglo-Saxons were putting up a good fight, but when Harold took a stray arrow to the eye, his men scattered, something which could have easily gone the other way. Overnight, the bastard transformed into the conqueror. There were no other battles. England was his. Remember
These nicknames or titles are so confusing because you were called, like, you would call yourself the bastard after it was given to you. Was that an insult by other people? Is it something that you, like, as much as you might have disliked it, you had to change it through action, and so you didn't change it? Curious.
To the conqueror. There were no other battles. England was his. Remember that list of invaders of England? It's fascinating to examine who made the biggest impact on the island's culture and demographics. Was it the Romans who built cities, forts, and roads? Was it the Anglo-Saxons who dominated for centuries? Was it the Norse who caused the former to unite and develop their military and administration? Nope, it was none of these. Not even close.
Even if it was one of them, or they had, like, I'm sure all of the above, but we look back in history at all the things that happened and question through videos like this, you know, alternate history, what would have happened if this? And it seems a miracle that history turned out the way it did because of all of the little things that could have happened. Except there's a giant problem with that, is that if they didn't happen and history was changed, then we would be calling that changed history a miracle. And so it's like the survivor bias. It's like, oh my God, there has to be divine intervention for this and this and this to happen. And if this didn't happen, then all of the rest wouldn't have mattered. It's like, yeah, but something has to happen. You know? And so it's a little silly saying something is like, oh, but that's so crazy. It's like, no, what would be crazy if nothing happened? But something happens, and so, you know what I mean?
Just 7,000 men who inherited the kingdom
Stay
and
hydrated,
sprung
guys.
out the majority of its dynasties dominated every aspect of Anglo-Saxon life. Pretty much everything we know about medieval England relates to this new version of it. Stone castles? Norman. Heavy cavalry? Norman. Powerful navy? Norman. Feudalism in England? Norman. Architecture, law, literature, religion, all of it imported by the Normans. And
once again, this is the story of a country for countries everywhere. And so it might seem as if, like, well, this is now English. That's how history seems to work. It's not like history isn't one people settled in an area in Neolithic times, and then forever they stayed in that area with no other humans, and now they are a pure form of culture of that original people. That doesn't exist anywhere. And so this being a story is the story of, I'm sure, similar to how every other people's experience over time. Does that make sense?
when I say religion, all of it imported by the Normans. And when I say Normans, I really mean the French. And when I say the French, I really mean French adjacent. The Normans weren't descendant from the Franks or anything. They had a distinct culture of their own. They were descendant from the Norsemen, after all, which is how we got the name. But they did speak a variety of Old French, and compared to the Anglo-Saxons, well, they might as well have been French. That's all that matters. When William was crowned in Westminster Abbey for the first time, the ceremony was in French, and French continued to be the language of the elites until 1362. The Old English language basically went underground for 3 centuries, at least in formal occasions. The peasants could speak whatever they wanted, who cared? But just think about that. For a longer span of time than the United States has existed, the main language of England was French.
That's crazy.
It's kind of a shame we lost the great Anglo-Saxon names of Ethelstan, Edwig, Ecgfrith, and Cadwalla. Now we'd have a millennia of Edwards, Charles, and Georges. What a pity. When it comes to the Normans, history truly is written by the victors, and William did everything in his power to enforce that idea. He commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry, giving his rendition on—
Is it fair to say that England is the least native Britannic of all of the British countries? Is that fair to say? Because they were influenced most by outside people. And so the places like, even like Cornwall, you could say, which is part of England, but Cornwall or Wales or large parts of Ireland and Scotland, they would be closer to a more genuine native Britain than the English. Is that fair to say?
On events to enforce that idea. He commissioned
Well, they are probably also heavily influenced by Vikings as well.
the Bayeux Tapestry, giving his rendition on events, and why he just had to replace the Witan with an absolute monarchy. He replaced 90% of all lords and bishops in England with loyal Normans, and he dotted the land with castles, a move which allowed for less than 10,000 people to enforce their will on 2.5 million. This land would be reshaped in their Norman French image. When the dust settled, the culture propagated by Charlemagne was nearly homogeneous from York to Naples, from Bordeaux to Budapest, a feudal west with greater ties to the papacy. So, in such an alternate timeline where William loses, obviously none of that happens. Much of what we think of as England today would be lost, but also much would be gained. Without William, England would still exist.
So would England be more of a Nordic, native Britannic and Nordic? Again, I'm saying native Britannic, kind of going against what I said earlier, because no one is really purely native. But would it be just more Nordic influence, maybe?
Lost, but also much would be gained. Without William, England would still exist, but it would go into the second millennia as something different, something untouched by French influence, an alternative, more Germanic England in both culture and institution, one that in this scenario isn't wiped away. It's an alternative 1066. Instead of Harold Godwinson and his family laying dead on the battlefield, it's William and his followers. Godwinson was king. His family controlled 3 earldoms, while the rest were extremely loyal to him. He had 2 sons, martial experience from fighting the Welsh, and especially after defeating 2 of the most badass warriors of the age. Like his predecessor Edmund, who also fought off invaders, Godwinson is nicknamed Harold Ironside and begins consolidating his rule. So one of the most fascinating aspects of this scenario is that the Witan, this election council, would remain preserved, although the Anglo-Saxon practice of slavery would remain as well. It wasn't so much that William abolished slavery, he never outright did. It was just that Anglo-Saxon society relied much more on slavery for labor, while Western Europe relied on servitude. While some peasants, criminals, and war captives are still enslaved in this alternate timeline, English women ironically would have the right to hold property and inherit land, something that William took away. So it was a give and take. It's most likely that eventually slavery would come to an end in England, just not as quickly as it did with the dramatic reforms of the Normans. And speaking of which, one of the reforms of the Normans was to give England stronger ties to the Catholic Church. You see, in our timeline, William's invasion was actually sanctioned by Pope Alexander II.
Wow, that would be a giant difference.
Despite being
so a lot less church influence.
Officially,
that more than anything I've heard so far would probably have the most far-reaching consequences for many centuries.
Christian and Catholic, the Pope Alexander II. Despite being officially Christian and Catholic, the Anglo-Saxon Church had some influences from the native cultures that had only recently been converted. There were still many Celtic and Germanic influences within the English Church. The island was removed from the continent in
What is that
sense,
symbol?
and the papacy despised it. It was pretty much an island of pseudo-paganism. The last few popes, in fact, wanted something to be done about the Anglo-Saxons, and that's where William came in. This wasn't to say the church had no influence. They did. Years earlier, Alexander II was able to...
I can't believe how much can be portrayed by simple shaving off of top or bottom parts of a black circle for eyes can show just how... That's fascinating. Like, look, bottom part of the eye shaven off, he's happy.
Church had no influence. They did. Years earlier, Alexander
Top part, mad or frustrated.
II was able to sway the Witan to elect the previous king, Edward the Confessor, a king who would go on to...
Crap, I'm not paying attention.
Church had no influence. Anglo-Saxons, and that's where William came in. This wasn't to say the church had no influence. They did. Years earlier, Alexander II was able to sway the Witan to elect the previous king, Edward the Confessor, a king who would go on to become a canonized saint because of his piety. He was a direct inspiration for Baylord the Blessed. Thanks, George. And while he's still celebrated in 2 churches today, at the time, his death left open a power vacuum, one that William had to fill. Otherwise, the ironically named Godwinson would rule instead, and the pagan influences would continue.
Ironically
so what's the
named.
deal here? Would it really be that big of a deal for the church if Godwinson had won instead of William? Yeah, probably. For one, Godwinson would know the Pope specifically sponsored another rival to depose and kill him. For another,
More like
Godwinson
poop.
did not implement the reforms that the church had been wishing for. So from the Pope's perspective, England was still out of line. Either way, without the Normans, the church doesn't implement massive reforms within England. They don't build new monasteries. And if you really think about it, reintroduce true Latin Catholicism to England. This can go 2 ways. Either Godwinson or his successors eventually make up with the church and do the reforms the popes wanted at the cost of their own kingly autonomy, but with some nice political points, or this divide between the Anglo-Saxon Church and the Church of Rome gets even greater. Britain isn't just culturally different from mainland Europe without the Norman French, it could be religiously different as well. And that's the more interesting scenario, so I'm going with that. It's possible we
Fair.
could see an orthodoxy-like split from Rome, but with Celto-Germanic elements, much like how the Greeks split with the Latins, gradually distancing over culture until it was too late to mend the differences. The archbishops of Canterbury and York, in a way, become like the patriarchs of the East. Perhaps they become the patriarchs of the North. Perhaps instead of the Protestant Reformation centuries later, Northern Europe just splits now under a more unified Northern Church, unified in their Germanic culture. Could this spawn a crusade? Perhaps, but it really depends on when this split happens and how quickly. I will say, for the most part, I could just imagine this being one more branch disconnecting Anglo-Saxon England from the mainland. We'll leave it at that. In the next 5 years of this alternate timeline, Harold consolidates his kingdom, rallies his men to finish the job he started in Wales. The Normans performed a similar maneuver in 1081, taking the less mountainous South Wales, and the same happens here, albeit a little sooner. The lesson is no matter who controls England, the Welsh always lose. Harold would plunder 2,000 sets of heavy armor, training his own regiment of heavy cavalry, which combined with his shield wall, harkened back to the hammer and anvil tactics of Alexander the Great. Tens of thousands would be taken into slavery. Then he would turn his sights north against the Gaelic Scots. Scotland, as always, was a thorn in the English side, and their kingship raids was something the Anglo-Saxons had to put up with for centuries. Each time a new Scottish king ascended the throne, he'd go on a raid, plundering neighboring English lands. Already on shaky grounds with the Pope, Harold Ironside would march his men north yet again, crushing all resistance in his path. The mountainous parts of Scotland were no interest to him, not to mention impossible to tame. Instead, he takes Carlisle, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, before making Malcolm III the Earl of the newly created Cumberland. It's important to note that in our timeline, William made similar moves, but the reason why this is so significant is because in this alternate timeline, nobody genocides the North. In our timeline, the last Anglo-Saxon resistance remained alive and well in the land of Northumbria. Supported by Danes overseas, the Anglo rebels killed William's newly appointed Earl. And William kinda lost it. He went into a frenzy. This is what historians now call the harrying of the North, but it's something that I as a YouTuber call killing everyone. Throughout the North,
Oh god, just being a normal, regular person who's like not in the army that's killing the person sent by William or Godwinson. Right? We're in the alternate timeline, right?
And William,
Oh, William, this is in the regular timeline, of course. Sorry, so it is William right now. But just being a normal person who had nothing to do with like killing with, you know, the Normans sending a person up there to be in charge of stuff, and nothing to do with the people killing the guy, and then you're just slaughtered because he's pissed off at that guy dying, even though you had nothing to do with it. Oh my God, that's so frustrating. And frustrating from my standpoint, freaking terrifying from if I was there.
William kinda lost it. He went into a frenzy. This is what historians now call the harrying of the North, but it's something that I as a YouTuber call killing everyone. Throughout the North, entire communities were put to the sword. Nobody was spared. This was a vengeance that was personal. Laws were passed just to devastate Northumbria, and some counties lost 75% of their population. It's estimated that 100,000 people died as a result of starvation and murder, while many others fled to Scotland. Honestly, this is the one time when the thing George copied from history ended up being less brutal. Like, when Aegon conquered Westeros, he burned a field.
Dang it, I've never seen Game of Thrones. I don't know these references.
And a few brutal. Like, when Aegon conquered Westeros, he burned a field and a few nobles, but the average peasant was spared. William did not do that. Entire regions were wiped out. This foreign Norman brutally reshaped Anglo-Saxon England in his image. These tactics were so effective that, to this day, most people see William as the founder of England rather than the noble that took it over, something that his epitaph truly entails. In this alternate timeline, Harold, already being the king, had no reason to set fire to a huge chunk of his country. He defeated both foreign invaders. In fact, instead of being completely nuked, the semi-autonomous Northumbria actually remains
One of the most terrifying things about history is that the vast majority of deaths in history seem to be killing people that had nothing to do with anything. And that is just so devastating and terrifying and angering, and people suck. I love people. Humans are great, but humans are also awful.
extremely prosperous. So what would the future hold for this alternate England? That is really just England as it would have been already. Is everything just peaceful now? Of course not.
No.
It's just instead of wars being fought inside England to get rid of rebels, England goes on the offensive. When we look at expansionist kings, they rarely tend to stay put after a few successes, and Godwinson, now Ironside, would be no different. The Anglo-Saxon kings had a deep connection to lands across the sea, and just as William of Normandy tried to claim legitimacy in another land,
Wow, good point. So a lot of history would be fighting between some Nordic countries and the British Isles rather than the French and the British Isles.
Harold might try to do the same. He was
That's
a descendant
fascinating.
of Canute the Great after all, and Harold might wish to also possess two crowns. I could imagine that with so much success and stability on the home front, Harold might emphasize his connection to Olaf II Haraldsson, the former king of Norway, arguing his own legitimacy for the crown. Maybe he even tries to claim it through an invasion of Denmark. Instead of seeing a period of castles and exploitation under William, Harold instead attempts to unite the Danes and Anglo-Saxons under one banner, sailing an armada of 300 ships against Svein II. Svein had spent most of his rule dealing with religious matters and fathering over 20 children out of wedlock. His military record was poor, and he didn't stand a chance against this force of Anglo-Saxons. If there was a time to take Denmark, it was now. It's kind of funny, imagining the English being the one raiding Scandinavia. How this goes, who's to say? But if he was successful, just like Canute the Great, Harold Ironside would hold two crowns by the ripe age of 50. Following the ancient customs, his sons were deeply involved in the politics of the crown, and since they had a strong connection to Ireland, it's easy to assume that the eldest, Godwin Haraldson, might take it upon himself to expand Anglo-Saxon influence to the Isle. Given Godwin's familiarity with the King of Leinster, he forms a pact with the King and Ulster, installing himself as High King of Ireland, while gaining some XP points along the way. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would it be so easy for the Anglo-Saxons, who nearly faced annihilation a moment ago, to go off and form an actual empire within 20 years. Simple. Momentum in medieval warfare swung dramatically back and forth, at least prior to siege warfare. Things were really all or nothing. If Harold was able to not die on the battlefield, then who's to say how long and prosperous his reign could have been? He was elected for his skills as a warrior, after all. He inspired his men, and if he had a legitimate claim to take Denmark, I don't see why he wouldn't. War in this time was a gamble, and if you won big. But if you lost, then well, when it comes to history, timing is everything. While William had an extended family, which ended up dominating Western Europe for the next few centuries, his personal legacy hinged all on the outcome at Hastings. And if he lost Hastings, then not shockingly, it wouldn't be good for him. At the time, Brittany and Anjou were unstable. Aquitaine was busy with the Reconquista, but most importantly for William, his heir and the French king were both 14 years old at the time. Enter Baldwin. No, not the cool-looking leopard dude. Baldwin V of Flanders, William's father-in-law and royal regent. Before he dies a year later, perhaps he secures Normandy for his daughter, who also happened to be William's wife. And the king had a history of disinheriting children in order to expand his power. You have to remember that William took all of his loyal supporters with him, so if he lost, Normandy would be pretty much defenseless. Not to mention his 2 decades of territorial expansion pissed off a lot of noble lords. Say 14-year-old Robert goes off on a hunt, never to return. Now squabbling barons see their duchy sliced into pieces, with big chunks going to the French crown and the county of Flanders. Today, Philip is remembered as a conciliatory king who centralized the crown and built up its army, which is horrible news for the Normans. Does this mean that France gets centralized earlier than in our own history? Yeah, probably, but nothing too crazy. Flanders and Aquitaine would still rival the crown when it came to finances and military.
This is the thing. So I'm about to say something that the thing about alternate history stuff, and this doesn't take away anything from alternate history videos. I love them, but as like they drastically, like I would say exponentially, become less possible of that thing happening the further you go away from that alternate history change. So as soon as you go away from, okay, Godwinson defeats, William the Conqueror is defeated at the Battle of Hastings there. Like, as soon as that moment happens, you can think about a lot of different things that might happen immediately after that. But as the further you go in time, like, he could have died from dysentery 2 years later, or this might happen. So I'm not saying that it's useless to do alternate history stuff. It's fascinating. But that's the one issue. And one thing I kind of think about is I wonder if British supremacy of the waves in later centuries might be jeopardized from this, in that, the big seafarers were the Portuguese and the Spanish, and then eventually, the French and the English as well. And if I wonder if there wasn't that connection and feuding and wars with the French that the English had with the French, then maybe they wouldn't have gotten as much intellectual or technological improvement in in seafaring and in shipbuilding, and then maybe France becomes the ultimate superpower and the king of the waves, right? And so I've thought about that, but I also understand that alternate history is very difficult to predict the further you go after the change in history you pick for the topic. But that came to mind. So I wonder if that could have happened. Anyways.
Flanders and Aquitaine history? Yeah, probably, but nothing too crazy. Flanders and Aquitaine would still rival the crown when it came to finances and military strength, but the Norman administrative code would speedrun some aspects of bureaucracy. The biggest change here in this alternate timeline is the centuries of conflict between England and France. A defining fundamental part of two nations' history just doesn't didn't happen. England, under the Normans, always meddled in French affairs, as England was simply one part of a greater kingdom. William was a king of England, but also a subject to the French crown. Him messing in French affairs was annoying, but understandable. A foreign king intervening in France, however, is simply an invasion, and since the French had already built a ton of castles in the north, England doesn't stand a chance. I mean, sure, you can take the man out of the north, but you can't take the Norse out of the man. Harold and his future descendants might launch a few pillaging campaigns, but there's never an attempt to hold French land like William did. They'd have no legitimacy, no connection politically or otherwise to meddle in the mainland. Not now, not for a few centuries.
And let's be real, the kind of more advanced societies of the time were, you know, your Byzantines, your maybe some Italian states, maybe, you know, I mean, the Spanish are still reconquisting, and the Franks, obviously. And so by not being in constant conflict with them, you might lose a lot of your advancement. I'm basically reiterating what I said about possibly not being, you know, as good at seafaring as he became to be.
Think about that. After William's defeat, the only land the English would have claim to in France would be Normandy, but that province would get gobbled up by the crown in Flanders. This is such a dramatic change to our history. It really changes the character of Western Europe. Like, there's no 100 Years' War, no Joan of Arc, no constant centuries of squabbling between these two kingdoms. Instead, these two kingdoms would remain two separate foreign kingdoms. Maybe
I might be speaking Spanish or French if this didn't happen. That's just crazy.
going to war once in a while, but never for any legitimacy claims like the Normans had. England would focus its attention with its northern neighbors, not the south. Perhaps if the Anglo-Saxons got their wish, they might maintain a North Sea empire. But whether they do or not, that original cultural connection between Scandinavia and the British Isles might continue on for centuries onward, something that will certainly affect the very evolution of the English language itself. English is considered a Germanic language, but kind of like how Greenland is considered a part of North America. I mean, yeah, I guess, where else would you really put it? But it doesn't feel like it. I mean, roughly 60% of our words come from Latin or French. No matter what study you use or how you compute it, the German elements of English are a minority within the language. Like I mentioned earlier, the Normans fundamentally altered the English language. They simplified the hell out of it, to the point where Old English, nearly identical at one time to Old German, became unrecognizable over time, evolving into New Middle English, or Anglo-Norman. Inflections were reduced. The different forms of verbs reflecting mood, tense, and person were gone. Unique letters were obliterated.
No, not the A.
Noun gender assignment, present in many modern languages, was cut. All of this made English a malleable language, easy to learn. By connecting it to the Franco-Latin speaking world, that region's science, art, and literature permeated throughout the Isle. The literature. How do you even describe alternate literature? You really can't, because it doesn't exist. How can we imagine how literature and culture in this place would be? I guess we kind of have to get creative. For one, Chaucer. Everyone knows Chaucer.
Geoffrey.
The father of English literature. While he was instrumental in using the commoner
I had no idea that
Chaucer, the father
that this is. I always said Geoffrey.
of English literature. While he was instrumental in using the commoner language for writing, a unique thing in England despite being born 2 centuries after the
Canterbury
conquest,
Tales?
his championing of the English language was still an English that had been transformed already by the Normans. Old English shifted into Middle, an English that was now riddled with French. Of course, 2 more centuries later, we would have Shakespeare, who wrote in early modern English, but that language was already built upon the former's foundations. So what I'm getting at here is, what would this alternative English have been like
Butterfly
without
effect.
the Normans? Well, for one,
Probably more akin to Dutch or Danish.
One, it remains Germanic. This alternate England would move forward the next few centuries far more influenced by Scandinavian and North German culture than anything French, even if the whole North Sea Empire thing fell apart. Now, in the long term, this isn't as dramatic as you might think. It's not like England would remain a bunch of Vikings forever. Scandinavia didn't remain Vikings forever. One day, castles and knights may come, but with a northern flair. As much as I could rant about all of this, for the sake of timing, let's just say that in both language and culture, the North Sea would be very closely related. From an outside perspective, English wouldn't really sound that much different from languages like Danish, Dutch, Frisian, and Northern German. I guess really the best metaphor I can use for this is King Arthur. When you think of...
I feel like we would be an extended Netherlands. And with maybe still a little bit of French flair in there just because of our proximity. But Dutch is even closer to France, so...
King Arthur,
I mean, Netherlands.
You probably imagine a noble king, fighting in a chivalrous fashion,
Round
leading
Table.
a band of loyal knights. But the actual myth is old, very old. King Arthur is a figure rooted in the culture of the Welsh, a figure that was a mythical hero that fought against the invading Anglo-Saxons.
Not mythical, he was
no
real.
Round Table, no divinely ordained leadership, he might not have even been a king. No matter what the origins of the original Arthur was, it doesn't matter, because what the legend of Arthur became was one molded by Norman culture. It smoothed out the edges of Arthur, made him more refined, one who acted in the Norman fashion, as that's what a true king of England was. The very elements we think of as Arthurian were later added on by the Normans, a version aimed to solidify the new status quo. Blood decided the leader, not some pagan Watan council. It was this version that almost single-handedly created the hero's journey. While ironically Arthur began as a Welsh figure who fought off the Anglo-Saxons, under the Anglo-Saxons he could have transformed into a general mythical figure of England, just one with more Viking elements, if you will. Perhaps this version of Arthur is more Beowulf than noble king, something kind of characteristic of an alternate England as a whole. The fact is, the Vikings had an enormous amount of stories to tell, most of which were lost to the ages, due to them writing their different runic system on wood or stone. But what happens when the Anglo-Saxons, who generously funded monasteries, are actually given peace and prosperity? I think we might see Christian beliefs mixed in with pagan pantheons, much like how the Latin world incorporated former Roman and Greek myths. And so these stories, kind of lost to time, might be preserved. The foundational great works of art for England, many more stories just like Beowulf or the Exeter Book and Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Literature reflects the ideas of the contemporary writers, and since the culture isn't put into the same Franco-Latin blender as the rest of Europe, we might see some incredible stories that we otherwise never would have. Thanks, Normans. Thanks for everything. So, fun fact, I did one of those
we never would have heard these stories.
ancestry test things, and my ancestry map looks like this. 60% from southern England, but more specifically for this case, northern France.
Oh. I'm like from here, like Greater London to like middle and west of Ireland to like Cumbria area. That's where 98% comes from. So
my last name, by the way, is of Anglo-Norman origin. Oh god, did my ancestors commit war crimes against the Danish? Once again, special thanks to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video.
okay, great video. But again, it's so I don't think I'm gonna reiterate what I said before. So so much can change. This doesn't take away from the practice and the experiment of thinking about alternate history scenarios. Nobody can know for sure, and it's fun to think about how stuff might be, and it's also very educational because it's like, oh wow, that affected that a lot. That affected that a lot. and you might not have otherwise thought of it without a cool exercise like this. But maybe if William the Conqueror was annihilated and lost at Battle of Hastings, maybe Normandy would have been quickly conquered by the French, and then the French might have just gone up to England and started their own thing, because the force there had to fight the Danes up north and then immediately fight the Normans. And so maybe if we go, third time's the charm, we win and take it over. And so maybe rather than being less French because William the Conqueror failed, the British might have been more French, because maybe now it's not just Normans invading and starting new history. It could be Philip the King of France's armies now marching in, and you could become more French. And so it can tip both ways so quickly. Fascinating video. Love you all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. And hopefully I'll see you guys next video. We'll keep on learning together. Bye, guys.